Polytricks, institutions, and social progress in Jamaica. Chapter 1. The driving force of socio-economic change. The persistent poverty, the economic stagnation, and the constant decline of the social conditions in Jamaica are commonly explained by the failures of the policies of successive political regimes. Thus, for example, the talk shows on radio are almost completely about public policies and politicians, especially in relation to the persisting hardships continuously experienced by the majority of the population. Evidently, this line of reasoning is common sense. We commonly hear it from persons in the street and from political pundits, academic and otherwise. Now, there is no doubt that the policies of the political regimes are indeed the proximate causes of our socio-economic failures, but are they the essential causes of these failures? Section 1. Determining the actions of political officials. In fact, after more than 50 years of failures of every single political regime, it makes plain common sense simply to ask, what determines the policies and the actions of any political regime of the Jamaican state? Wouldn't this be useful critical thinking, the widespread absence of which is widely recognized? To help locate the determinants of the actions and policies of public officials, consider 1. When Bruce Golding, then Prime Minister, PM, of Jamaica, wanted to rid himself of his bugbear, Stephen Vashiani, who had, most unfortunately for Golding, been earlier appointed Solicitor General, he found that, although being the most powerful man in Jamaica, he just could not up and fire Vashiani. So he requested that the Public Services Commission, PSC, the institution empowered by law to hire and fire certain categories of public servants, to fire Vashiani. But, here too, his endeavor was frustrated. The PSC asserted its constitutional right of institutional independence. Having itself hired Vashiani, it properly found itself with no other acceptable choice but to defend its appointee. So what then did the desperately determined Golding do? He resorted to his institutionalized power, to hire and fire members of the PSC, to get rid of the incumbents and to empanel a new set of commissioners. The new panel duly fired Vashiani, immediately and shamelessly. The clear lesson to take away from this sordid, but elucidating, affair is that the PM, in his actions, is severely constrained by public institutions. 2. Back in 2012, the current finance minister, after having flatly declared his rejection of the IMF's suggestion that there should be a 25% haircut, reduction, of the principal amounts owed on locally held GOJ bonds, had to locate equivalent amounts of money, without borrowing, to fill the resulting financial gap in the IMF program. The finance minister quickly decided to raid the National Housing Fund held by the National Housing Trust on behalf of its contributors, past and current working people and employers in Jamaica. However, the finance minister found that he just could not take this money as fast as he would have preferred. Rapidity was important since time is money. The finance minister first had to go to Parliament, certain of the support of its constitutionally institutionalized majority, and change the law that would have made him a criminal if he had succumbed to his haste. Only then was he empowered, by the institution of law, to raid the NHF without fear of fine or confinement. 3. In fact, the finance minister may not ordinarily touch the public purse, constitutionally termed the Consolidated Fund, without subjecting himself to the constitutionally institutionalized procedure. Firstly, he has to submit a money bill to the Parliament. If the faithful majority acts with its usual canine loyalty, the bill becomes an Appropriations Act of Parliament, a law. Secondly, The finance minister may then only make withdrawals under the Appropriations Act by means of submissions of warrants. In addition to such normal appropriations, the finance minister, in times of emergencies, may also make direct drawdowns without raising a money bill in Parliament. These cases make it clear that even the most powerful officials in the state are constrained by institutions that prescribe how they should act. Furthermore, looking towards the future, it is also clear that these cases teach us that we may usefully look towards developing institutions both to constrain and to incentivize our public officials so that they may usually act as good public servants. So, if as popularly believed, it is the lack of political will that determines the failures of the regimes, then properly fashioned institutions may correct such situations. So, at this point, it seems that institutions may be primary causes both of the behavior of political regimes and, so, of socio-economic change. Section 2. Determining the root causes of social change. Furthermore, the rapid changes of political processes do not match the steady persistence of the economic stagnation, nor with the persistence of the social decline. However, the persistence of the almost unchanged political and economic institutions adopted in 1962 perfectly matches the persistence, since then, of our socio-economic underperformance. This correspondence may indicate causation, since, if institutions are indeed the driving force of socio-economic change, then, in the absence of changes in the institutions, we may expect unchanged socio-economic outcome. It also follows that if changes of institutions give rise to changes in the socio-economic outcomes, then the case for causation becomes even greater. Causation is established unless, or until, some other element in social existence is found to be the cause of the changes both in institutions and in socio-economic outcomes. Therefore, the evidence and the reasoning so far presents partial proof, in summary, that institutions that constrain the decisions and the actions of the whole government, and the actions of the politically powerless population as well, are the essential causative agents of social and economic change. In order to further concretize the generality of this point, a review of our history here on the rock is in order. After the almost comprehensive extermination of the Tainos in Jamaica by the Spaniards and the subsequent capture of the island by the British, the virtually depopulated island of Jamaica was effectively before the British as a clean slate on which to create, from scratch, a brand new society. So, they freely, that is, according to their nature and inclinations, chose to create the slave colony of Jamaica. Specifically, the political institution of the British state created the political institution of the Jamaican colonial slave state and the economic institutions of Jamaican slavery. The political institution of the slave colony of Jamaica was organized as follows. 1. There was a governor who was an employee and representative of the colonial office of the British state. The first of whom was Sir Henry Morgan, the infamous privateer. 2. The island's legislature was comprised of two chambers. The Legislative Council comprising the governor, the Chief Justice, the Bishop of the Anglican State Church, and 6 other members nominated by the governor. Appointments to the Legislative Council, ultimately, were instituted at the pleasure of the Crown. The other chamber was the Assembly that had 47 elected members. The electors were British colonists who gained suffrage by economic franchise, the value of land owned, the rate of rent paid, or the amount of taxes paid. Candidature for the Assembly required significantly higher levels of economic qualifications than those for elector. Since the mid-1700s, the Assembly originated all bills, imposed taxes, and made appropriations from the revenue, that is, it had both legislative and executive functions. The Assembly was elected for 7 years periods. The Legislative Council had the powers to amend or reject bills. The governor could give his assent to, or reject, bills or pass them on for a decision by the sovereign in council, the British Parliament. Furthermore, the sovereign in council could reject all bills, even those with the governor's assent. 3. The island's local government consisted of 22 parishes, so called because each coincided with a religious constituency of the Anglican Church, the State Church of Britain. A custos rotolorum, appointed by the governor, presided over the parish government called the vestry. The vestrymen included the parish rector, the local justices, and elected members for a total usually of 10 men. Each vestryman had a distinct portfolio such as roads and ways, canals and waterways, church property, and so on. The same voters elected representatives both to the vestry and to the assembly. The economic institutions of slavery in Jamaica, the slave plantations, were created by the British state by means of land grants, each of the order of 2,000 to 3,000 acres to British colonists. This slave economy of Jamaica was supported by the transatlantic slave trade, an economic institution created under law by the British state. It provided a sustainable supply of cheap labor differing critically from the immigration of colonists. The importation of slaves, by providing a ready resupply to replace expired laborers, allowed for the unrestricted exploitation of the enslaved Africans, and generally for the extremely cruel treatment of our ancestors that too often was deadly. The great lesson to take away, at this point, from this review is that social and economic changes are determined both by political institutions and the economic institutions that they create. In fact, as we see here in the case of the slave colony of Jamaica, and in the histories of many other countries across the globe, political institutions can even create whole societies. Polytricks, institutions, and social progress in Jamaica. Chapter 2. Past attacks on institutions and ongoing attacks by institutions. Section 1. The institutional targets of our ancestors' struggles. In the approximately 20 serious rebellions against slavery, from 1678 to 1832, the actions of our ancestors, be they rebelling slaves, actually then acting freely, or fighting maroons, were all directed against the plantations, the economic institutions of slavery in the Jamaican slave colony. After delivering blow after blow, generation after generation, against their enslavers, and, coincidentally and without any coordination, then assisted by favorable conditions in the British Parliament, in 1831 our ancestors led by Sam Sharp, in their greatest effort ever, finally smashed the whole slave plantation system, the economic institutions of slavery in Jamaica. In fact, by smashing the economy based on chattel slavery, by cutting and clearing the path to the wages system of labor, our ancestors actually delivered us all from slavery by means of accomplishing a truly great economic revolution. Praises be to our ancestors. The transatlantic slave trade, that other economic institution critical to slavery in Jamaica, had already been abolished in 1807 by Britain. This was done, not from any altruistic motivation, but rather was done, firstly, due to the greater strategic economic importance of the slave economy of the colony of San Domingo, now called Haiti, to its military and commercial rival France than Britain's own Caribbean slave economies were to Britain itself. And, secondly, to the dependency of the rapidly expanding economy of San Domingo on the transatlantic slave trade dominated by British ships. However, the political institutions of slavery, constituted into the colonial state, were left intact after the abolition of slavery, and with the excesses of violence and passion of the slave plantations then at an end, they immediately reappeared after emancipation within the state penal institutions. As George William Gordon complained to Lord Cardwell, Secretary of State for the Colonies in March 1865, early after emancipation, for a period of time shortened due to its manifest excessive cruelty, the treadmill was introduced. Then early in 1865, corporeal punishment, by use of the Cat 09, for second offences of petty crimes was first used in the state penal institutions of Jamaica. This was a first for the whole British Empire as well. Now, petty crimes included petty predial larceny and trespassing, crimes that were easily fixed on the rural poor, the latter charge often being used to dispossess our ancestors from land that they had in fact purchased. So, as the plantation owners, with their control of both the island and local colonial governments and of the justice system, in their endeavor to reduce wages and to avail themselves of abundant and cheap labor, terribly harassed the rural poor with courthouse, jailhouse and lashes. Then, due to such, and further, aggravation, the rabid and debased political institution of the Jamaican colonial slave state, by then actually baseless, that is, without the base of a slave society, became the focus of the fierce attention of our free ancestors of St. Thomas in the East. The rebels attacked the police station in Morat Bay, seized arms and ammunition and freed their captive comrades. Then they turned on the vestry, the parish political institution of slavery. As Douglas Hall, in Free Jamaica, recounted. At Morat Bay, in the meantime, the vestry had met as planned, and while they were in session, Paul Bogle and a large gathering of armed people approached the courthouse square where the custos had assembled the local militia of about 20 men. The mob were met by the custos, who told them not to enter the square. They did so, and the militia withdrew to the steps of the courthouse. The custos then began to read the riot act, and at the same time people in the crowd began to throw stones. The custos ordered the militia to open fire, and some of the people fell to the ground. The mob then rushed the militia, who took refuge in the courthouse, and a siege began. Finally, the courthouse was set on fire, and as the inmates ran out, several of them were killed by the attacking people. Among the dead were the custos, Baron von Ketelhod, the Reverend Herskell, curate of Bath, a nearby town, and Seer Price, a black man who was a local builder. The rioters, in command of the town, set out on the following day, Thursday the 12th, to attack and plunder Bath and sugar estates down the line of the Plantain Garden River. Third day the first troops dispatched by reached Morat Bay. He, returned to Kingston, from Flamstead, dispatched another 100 troops by sea, ordered a detachment of white troops to march eastward along the Blue Mountain Range to approach the rioters from the interior, and proclaimed a state of martial law to exist over the whole county of Surrey, except Kingston. On Friday, Eyre himself set out by sea with 50 more troops, arriving at Morat Bay at 7 o'clock in the evening. The balance sheet of destruction and retaliation by itself tells a tale. On October the 11th, the rioters had killed 18 and wounded 31 people. Subsequently, they were responsible for the killing of 4 and the wounding of 3 others. They plundered 20 houses and shops and burnt down 5 buildings, including the Morat Bay Courthouse. The number of people killed by the militia on the October the 11th is not known, but the authorities were later responsible for the execution of 354 people by sentence of courts-martial, the shooting or hanging of 85 others without trial of any kind, the flogging of 600 men and women, and the destruction of nearly 1,000 huts, cottages, houses, and other buildings. Writing to the Secretary of State for the Colonies on November the 2nd, Eyre commented, "The retribution has been so prompt and so terrible that it is never likely to be forgotten." If the words rioters and mob are substituted by the word rebels, this otherwise succinct account clearly becomes rational. Mobs do not perform according to a plan, as clearly was in place and, moreover, was very effective. In fact, Bogle and his associates had previously given notice to a squad of policemen who had gone to Stony Gut to serve warrants of arrest on Bogle and others, of their objectives of going to the vestry and killing all white men and all the black men that would not join them. The policemen were also given a beating and made to swear to join colour and to cleave to the black. Clearly, there was a conspiracy. The attack in Morat Bay was well planned, prepared and executed. This was no riot, it was the first and decisive battle of the rebellion. On the recommendations of the Stork Commission, empaneled by the Colonial Office to inquire into the whole affair, the whole structure of the slave colonies' political institutions was abolished. The island legislature and the vestries were smashed and thrown on the dust heap of history. The Anglican Church was disestablished, was no longer a state church. Only the representative of the Colonial Office, the governor, was retained. This was the barest administrative necessity required for the continuation of colonial status in Jamaica. So the true essence of the Bogle Rebellion of 1865 was that it was a successful political revolution concocted and executed with the singular objective of overthrowing the wicked political institutions properly belonging to, but remaining after, slavery in Jamaica. Praises be to the ancestors. Section 2. The institutional basis of the party political culture and its party political perspective. With the aid of the sensationalistic media, the people generally focus on the political parties, including political regimes, and their political promises, and interests, intrigues, and individuals. In other words, the people focus on party politics. And with so much sauce and goodies on offer, and with plenty blame both to lay and to evade, and with the popular dominance of the political culture and spirit, party politics has remained center stage and in the spotlight of a bedazzled nation's gaze. However, the question naturally arises as to the origin and source of stability of this dominant perspective, the party political perspective, that party politics is the main, if not the only, determinant of social and economic changes. In the 1930s, during the British direct rule of Crown Colony in Jamaica, Eyre's hopes for perpetual social quietude were dashed. The ancestors of those times protested iniquitous working conditions. Their protests culminated, in 1938, in the first significant collective action since 1865. Now, however, there was no clear threat to the political institutions of the time. Yet, by now well experienced by the mounting challenges to its rule in its colonies, especially after the colonial conscripts returned from World War I much more racially conscious and nationalistic, many, in fact, were Garveyites, and with the memory of how our ancestors fought to their victories over slavery, the British, on the advice of the Moy Commission, designed and implemented a long-term project of significant political institutional transformation. The first phase of the project started in 1944 with the institution of internal self-government. Through this political institution, a limited delegation of political authority, in certain areas of local public affairs, was made to local elected politicians constituted into a pseudo-government, lacking the essential characteristic of real governments, sovereignty. Elections were held, for the first time ever, on the basis of universal adult suffrage. This was a way both for the colonial office to identify and pre-qualify viable political parties and prestigious compliant political aspirants, and also to engage the whole population into party political practice. So-called internal self-government existed from 1944 until 1962. With suitable leaders and their two parties identified and sanitized, and with all the people entrained in the political process, the project moved to the next stage. This stage began with the leaders being tutored in constitutional law by the British Colonial Office and then instructed to form a bipartisan committee constituted into a team of legal draftsmen and tasked to produce a draft of an independence constitution for Jamaica. Now, though nominally free to compose the document, the committee, nevertheless, had to make sure that it met the expectations of its British tutors. As we know, the bipartisan committee did brilliantly in the opinions of their British taskmasters. So the draft constitution was quickly elevated into law in the UK Parliament. However, here it played the lowly role of a mere schedule of an order of an act of the UK Parliament instead of the stellar role of the foundational document of a newly instituted independent country. Finally, the Constitution was put into force by another act of the UK Parliament, the Jamaica Independence Act, 1962. However, its deportation to Jamaica and into Jamaica's history was even much less auspicious. Basically, it merely came into operation in Jamaica by the mere passage of time, from the 5th of August, 1962 to the 6th of August, 1962. So Jamaicans merely slipped into independence to a tick-tock of the clock. The most significant independent action undertaken by Jamaicans was the changing of the flags. Just think, Jamaicans were not the first to proclaim their own independence. This is extremely strange. Someone had to inform Jamaicans of their independent status. Was it that Jamaicans were, somehow, ignorant of their own independence and had to be informed by a more insightful, considerate and experienced sovereign power, a mother sovereign, so to speak? No. It was in fact that there was really no independence. The whole thing clearly was a well-planned and well-executed act of long-term deception. The question is, why was all this time spent and trouble undertaken only to produce such a shameful scripted sham? Why was this elaborate deception planned, prepared, and implemented over a period in excess of 2 whole decades? What were these so important, yet unrevealed, objectives of the UK state in instituting so-called internal self-government and the shambolic independence in Jamaica? In order to answer the preceding questions, we may note that both acts of the UK state, in rolling out the recommendations of the Moy Commission, were to create political institutions including that of an electorate with the participation, for the first time, of all adult subject citizens on the basis of universal adult suffrage. Clearly, apart from the airy promises of self-government, the most striking actual change in the political landscape, subsequent to 1944, is the general inclusion of the whole adult population in the party political process. Under slavery, candidates supported by their different colonial parties vied for elective offices in the assembly and in the vestries. But slaves had no part in this activity of free men. So, clearly, in the struggles of our ancestors against their enslavement, party politics played no part. After slavery, but before 1944, economic qualifications for franchise excluded the majority of Jamaicans from party politics. So after 1944, a majority of the people, for the first time ever, became engaged and enthralled by their novel inclusion in national and local party politics, as well as by the political promises of self-government. The first result of this was that over the 18 years of so-called internal self-government, The previously disenfranchised majority was largely introduced into the political belief system of the social omnipotence of party politics. Note that this period is just long enough for the emergence of a whole new generation of innocent young voters and the passing of the cynical generations who had lived through the Bogle Rebellion and its aftermath. The upshot was that in the following period, that is during the deception of independence, now ongoing for over 50 years, party political culture has become entrenched in Jamaican public life and in the people's spirit. This process has been tremendously aided by the devilish clientelism permitted and encouraged by the insidious union of political representative and economic benefactor, patron, in the political institutions of the offices of the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Minister, the MP, and the Parish Councillor. Beneficiaries, clients, include not only those amongst the poor who are prepared to sell their votes, but also many business persons, professionals, and the dons, the government being the largest purchaser of goods and services in the country, and, strangely enough, the politician benefactors themselves. All this materially based buy-in by this wide range of social and political actors have fixed the party political perspective in the people's consciousness. So, on one hand, the people have long become chronically divided, often violently, by party loyalties and, on the other hand, the struggles for political office have become rabid, criminal, actually incendiary, and shameless. And the people, the politicians, and the pundits interpret all this excitement as being the real history of their country. Clearly, the Moi Commission, through the agencies of the bipartisan draftsmen and their two parties, is the originator, in Jamaica, of the popular party political culture, and thusly, also of its reflexive party political perspective. And just as clear is the fact that it is the exciting ongoing party political process, with its possibilities for rapid self-aggrandizement, favors, contracts, handouts, and tax breaks, that directly sustains the popular party political perspective. However, it was the introduction of the new political institution of so-called internal self-government into Jamaica and then the coming into operation of the political institution called Jamaica Constitution, 1962, brought into force by the political institution of the UK state, that laid the basis for, and generated, the party political process, its culture, and also, as intended, the popular party political perspective that the people cleave to, while it cleaves them apart. Again, here is illustrated the essential role played by institutions in bringing about social, cultural and even mental changes in human society. In fact, institutional changes, as demonstrated by the continuing successes of the recommendations of the Moi Commission, are the very basis and driving forces of the emergence of the party political process, culture, and perspective. So, the role of political institutions, as essential causes of social and economic changes has been affirmed, and brilliantly so, throughout the whole history of Jamaica since its capture by the British. Note, also, that there were no remarkable changes to the public economic institutions resulting from the Moi Commission's recommendations. This is because these colonial economic institutions were the very ones that were to be protected during the indefinite period of independence. For it was through these pre-existent public economic institutions that the British protected their economic interests in Jamaica, and these were the very ones that they themselves had instituted for their own purposes of extracting wealth from the excluded masses. These public economic institutions of colonialism worked so well for the British then that they decided that these institutions should remain after independence. Look around. Still to be seen are the old colonial marketing boards such as the Coconut Industry Board, the Cocoa Industry Board, the Coffee Industry Board, the Sugar Industry Authority, the Jamaica Tourist Board, and others. Through these exclusive economic institutions, the British had long satisfied their interests of extracting great wealth from the people and their commons. Independence was not to abolish, but to preserve, all these exclusive economic institutions in the interests of the British elite and of the emergent Jamaican elite. Hence independence saw the conversion of Jamaica from a crown colony of the UK to a neo-colony. A neo-colony is the unity, in a former colony, of new apparently independent exclusive public political institutions with the old exclusive and extractive public economic institutions developed by the former colonialists during their past direct rule. Party political democracy is the form of the Jamaican neo-colonial state. Party politics was never intended to change the general political and economic exclusion experienced by the excluded majority during colonialism, but to ensure its continuance. Hence the chronic popular disappointment of the excluded majority, on one hand, and, on the other hand, the absolute delight of the included minority. Party politics, therefore, is the veil of deception, providing unfounded hope of economic betterment for the desperate, a stage for the pretensions of self-determination for the nationalistic, designed, and so far successfully implemented, to secure the continued predominance of the rule, and of the satisfaction, only of the elites. In short, party politics is illusory. So party politics is not harmless, far from it. A review of the whole period of our history as an independent country reveals that in these times, when politicians, political parties and the party political perspective have been allowed free rein to demonstrate their usefulness, our people have been plagued, not only by economic stagnation, social decline, and increasing criminality in general, but also by political violence and political corruption, in particular, as well as by state atrocities. Submitting to the imperatives of a ruthless electoral process, many politicians have engaged, and developed, criminal alliances for purposes of electoral coercion. In return, the gang leaders have received significant public contracts, including those for the provision of protection on construction sites, official blithe, and irresistible legal representation. The coincidence of a political constituency and the turf of a criminal gang, associated with a political party, often produces the electoral fiefdom of the political garrison. This synergy of the politicians and the criminals has resulted in the generation of an entrenched, widespread and violent culture of organized crime both within Jamaica and in its diaspora. Let us recall, for emphasis, that back in 2010 prominent members of the business class, quite unusually, felt compelled to stage a mass demonstration, an activity usually abhorrent to such members of the gentry, in Emancipation Park so as to demand the breach of the synergy of the politicians and their criminal partners. Now, the genius of the masses have long noted that party political culture, despite the continuing failures of its promises and of its regimes, is still managing to retain a tight grip on the people's minds and spirits and have concluded that this mass irrationality was cunningly conjured in the constitutional constructions of the conspiring cousins that co-chaired the bipartisan legal drafting team. It is also purported that, having dastardly done their duties to the British state for which they would be generously rewarded, they may well have jointly declared to all in earshot, while holding aloft their hands in their respective iconic identification symbols of their political parties, words to the effect that we too hold them tight. So, it must be said that not all Jamaicans submit to the party political culture, nor look through the spectacles of the party political perspective. The Rastas are, as a group, outstanding in their abstention from party politics and may have been the source of the term Polytricks used mostly by them to derisively refer to party political culture and, especially, to the manipulations of the politicians. Rastas, traditionally, have always known that the party political perspective is illusory and have always referred to the reality of the system behind its illusions. It should now be clear that the totality of institutions, de jure and de facto, constitute the reality of human society, its social fabric. The social fabric is the system that the races refer to, that invisible hand, that ultimate mundane decider of all social questions, that conservative force that irresistibly works against the small man and in the interests of the big man, or for those well connected to these big men. From birth to death, individuals are enmeshed in this practicably inescapable social fabric. Banishment implies not only geographical exit, but more so institutional exit. Hermits do not lose their social status, and may indeed be institutions themselves. The fortunes and social status of an individual are generally determined by, or otherwise reflected in, the position that the individual holds in this fabric of institutions. Thereby, the nature of a society, and so also of its long-term social and economic outcomes, is determined by this social fabric of institutions. Therefore, in view of the failure, so far, of this party political process, culture, and perspective of socio-economic change to prove their relevance through providing useful solutions to, instead of multiplying, the pressing problems of our current history, shouldn't we be extending our mental explorations to the essential institutional causes of our persistently poor national socio-economic performance? Polytricks, Institutions, and Social Progress in Jamaica. Chapter 3. Institutions in Current History. Section 1. The functions and operations of modern Jamaican exclusive public institutions. Over the past 2 decades, the leadership groups in the political parties and their friends in finance, and all the leading companies, by virtue of having significant portions of their assets in government bonds, are in finance, have also developed their own synergy, one that sees them, for example, swapping offers of party financing for invitations to government bond-buying parties. So look around, who are doing extremely well materially. The leadership both of the financial sector and of the political parties, past and present, really stand out. So why is it that these two groups are doing so well when the vast majority of Jamaicans, including many honest professionals, are doing so badly? This is due to the exclusive nature of the Jamaican political institutions that have created exclusive economic institutions that together work to enrich political and economic elites and to impoverish the excluded majority. With the elites' control of, and influence in, these institutions, they ensure that wealth is extracted from the people and their commons and transferred to themselves. Hence, there is great and growing income inequality and poverty in the country. The political institution of Jamaica's Parliament established, for example, the economic institution of the Urban Development Corporation, UDC, the chief function of which seems to be to seize the natural resources of the people's commons, mostly on the shameful basis that they are crown lands, and to hand these over to the economic elites, while excluding the majority of Jamaicans from access. Similarly, the political institutions of the Jamaican state established the economic institution of the Bank of Jamaica that, amongst other things, offers government bonds to qualified private big financial businesses and not just to everyone. The resulting annual tax burden on the backs of the Jamaican people due to debt repayment is now more than the amount budgeted for the entire public administration of the country. Therefore, the sovereign debt is the chief instrument of extraction of wealth from the excluded majority and of its transfer to the included minority. That is, The taxes paid to service the national debt is the main drain of wealth from the excluded majority and the main source of enrichment of the included minority. Debt repayment is prioritized over health, education, social work, the environment, and the real economy. In fact, more money is paid down against the national debt, handed over to the bondholders, than the total allocated for the whole administration of the public services including health services, public water supply, schools and teachers, road building and maintenance, law and order, and so on. This fiscal preeminence of the financiers is, in fact, grounded in the Constitution. Jamaica is the only country, in the world, that has written into its constitution the repayment of debt, he, past Financial Secretary Dr. Wesley Hughes, said. There is no other country in the world with such a constitutional provision, and that gives a lot of confidence to our bondholders, especially the external ones. Section 119 of the Jamaican Constitution provides for the public debt to be charged on the Consolidated Fund. This constitutionally grounded synergy between the leading groups of the financiers and the political regime explains why it is that the finance minister, in the actual practice of his public office, clearly favors preserving the paper assets of the financiers over the building of steel and concrete houses for the people. That is, he prefers, acts very quickly, to preserve wealth already earned merely by purchasing paper instruments to stimulating growth in the real economy, here displaying a stumbling dalliance. And, while satiated elites are celebrating their great fortunes, the public health services, for one of many examples, are falling apart. Essential life-saving services such as dialysis, radiotherapy, and medical imaging services and even basic medical supplies are scarcely available from the public health system, and, as a result, poor people are dying everywhere, every day. And, by the way, the list of NHT houses that appears on the auction block keeps growing from day to day, even while there are over 550,000 residential squatters in Jamaica in 2015. Furthermore, while the majority of NHT contributors are not earning sufficient in order to qualify for a mortgage, the NHT has purchased the dead stock, called out a many, in order to financially rescue one of the included minority. The exclusive nature of the public political and economic institutions is the basis of the close relationship of the leading groups of the political regime and the financiers, as, for example, is obvious in the Economic Program Oversight Committee, EPOC, and especially brilliantly so in the union of its co-chairman. However, this same situation occurs in all so-called public-private initiatives, as is the EPOC. That is, there is a close and exclusive relationship of the political and the economic elites. In these so-called economic public-private initiatives, the government claims to represent the public and the private big business people represent themselves. Now, it is painfully clear that the government, in actual fact, does not represent the interests of the majority of Jamaicans. So this majority of the people, substantially, the real public, are critically excluded from having a voice at the table of economic decision-making. That is, the real public is excluded from so-called public-private initiatives. The exclusion is blatant. Even the Contractor General, an institution created to safeguard the real public's interests of eliminating the high levels of corruption attending public-private contracts, is only barely tolerated by the included minority near these public-private initiatives. Thusly, these so-called public-private initiatives are microcosms and instruments of extraction of the exclusive minorities ruling the Jamaican people. Hence, the general exclusion, both political and economic, and the resulting economic deprivation and social injustice experienced by the excluded majority. Specifically, once having exercised its right to elect, then the majority of the people are excluded from having a voice at the table of decision-making in political institutions. So, since it is the political institutions that create and regulate economic institutions, then the politically excluded majority end up also being excluded from decision-making in publicly owned economic institutions like the UDC and the BOJ, as well as in the public-private initiatives. Hence the interests of the excluded majority, as are evident, are at the bottom of the list of national priorities. The results, on one hand, are the economic deprivation and the social injustice experienced by the excluded majority and, on the other hand, the enrichment of the included minority. We are underserved, while they have the lion's share of the cake of national income. Section 2. Constitutional loopholes, the role of the oligarchs and outcomes. We have seen the finance minister showing just how it is that, for some persons, the law is not a shackle. In addition, we have seen the ability of a PM to get around the institutional independence of the Public Services Commission. The very same procedure used here may also be used to get around the similarly crucial constitutionally protected institutional independence of the Judicial and Police Services Commissions and Jamaica's Privy Council. From which it follows that the principle of institutional independence of state agencies such as judges, the DPP, the Auditor General, the Jamaica Civil Service, and the Jamaica Constabulary Force can be gotten around, as in the case of the Solicitor General. That is, all the constitutionally institutionalized checks on the excessive use of the powers of a political regime can be gotten around. The defeat of all constitutional checks on political power of regimes results from loopholes existing in the very safeguards of the integrity of the Constitution. In fact, the presence of such structural weaknesses in the security clauses of the Constitution fully compromises its integrity as the foundational basis of the rule of law, the latter being the principle that everyone is equal before the law. From this fact alone arises the impunity of the politicians and their associates, their business friends and the dons. In short, the principle of the rule of law does not hold in Jamaica. So this compromised, and therefore absent, rule of law committed by the Constitution itself allows some persons to legally avoid, by virtue of the existence of the constitutional vulnerabilities, the shackles of the law. These persons include members of the leadership group of any current political regime and, as we saw a while back in the case of the traffic ticket affair, members of the economic elite. This flouting of the rule of law, by the members of a political directorate and their moneyed friends, is based on constitutional loopholes so strategically located and cunningly implemented so as to allow for the existence, within a democratic shell, of an oligarchy, the latter being the collective despot of the included minority, members of which are called oligarchs. These constitutional loopholes also permit excessive, that is, oligarchic, influences, bordering on fear, exercised by members of the political regime and every real big man, the oligarchs and their friends, on many officers of the state. Whether by being oligarchs in waiting, or just by being friends of the oligarchs, even prominent members of the opposition are also big men and women. This situation paves the way, on one hand, for the political bullying of public servants and, on the other hand, to the political corruption of public administration. So the case studies reviewed reveal serious anti-democratic weaknesses in the very foundations of the Constitution, weaknesses undermining any claims to real democracy, as they clearly illustrate the operation of the oligarchy as it constitutionally undermines the rule of law. The constitutional accommodation of oligarchic behavior implies that the Jamaica Constitution, 1962, is itself oligarchic. It follows that, based as they are on an oligarchic constitution, The political institutions, and the economic institutions that they create, are similarly oligarchic, like produces like. So there are real and substantial oligarchic substrates in the state, from its steep de jure constitutional foundations lying beneath the layers of de jure political institutions founded on it, and up to its upper strata of de jure economic institutions created by the de jure political institution of the parliamentary majority. On top of these de jure institutions floats a thin, highly visible de facto institutional layer of the Polytricks of so-called party political democracy. This layer of institutions has so far been amazingly captivating and, though most often mistaken to be the driving force of history, as we have seen, it is actually bereft of historical initiative, and so is quite illusory. The function of the party political process is to distract the people from the oligarchic nature of the public institutions that actually determine social outcomes. This oligarchic nature of Jamaica's public institutions, including that of the constitution on which they are constructed, has remained unchanged during independence. Over this period, these oligarchic institutions have consistently produced the usual results seen in countries that have long been under oligarchic rule: persistent, massive and growing income inequality, due to the long absence of a level playing field in the economic institutions; persistent extreme poverty, due to the extractive nature of the exclusive political and economic institutions; persisting economic stagnation, due to the long-running monopoly of legitimate economic opportunities by a satiated economic elite long grown unaccustomed to innovating; and widespread, persistent and increasing criminality, being a part of the resulting long desperate search, by some members of the excluded majority, for betterment within the long reigning relative scarcity of legitimate opportunities. Along with all these unfortunate outcomes, one must also acknowledge that the violence of the electoral strife and the resulting tragic industrialization of criminal violence, including assassinations, arson, massacres, and political terrorism, as well as the associated emergence of Jamaican-based international criminal organizations, are all due to the struggles for elective public offices. Only the expectation of great self-aggrandizement could motivate the extremes of passion and the life and death struggles for political office that Jamaicans have unfortunately witnessed and from which they have suffered so much. The resulting destruction and deaths, as well as the accompanying moral and social degeneration, are due to the ruthless endeavors by the political aspirants to participate in the patrimony of the prized political pie as members of the included political elite, as members of the oligarchy. It is irrational to think that the virtuous passion for public service could ever drive so many to perpetuate such extremely egregious public disservice. Section 3. Constitutional loopholes, the oligarchy, and the real sovereign of Jamaica. A review of the Jamaica Constitution, 1962, shows that the loopholes that permit oligarchic behavior are all tied to the attribute of institutional independence guaranteed by the Jamaica Constitution, 1962. What is the nature of such an independence and how is it secured? Institutional independence is the freedom of an institution to determine its own findings and to initiate the institutionalized procedures that it decides to apply. It also protects the members of such institutions from removal, excepting for mental or bodily infirmities, or for misbehavior. So institutional independence does not imply independence of mind, as many may assume it does. Now, independence of mind does not sit well with the oligarchs, as we have seen in the case of the PM, the PSC, and Vashiani. Therefore, independence of mind may be a major disqualifier of membership, a misbehavior, in any public institution. Furthermore, we have all witnessed the harassment by the oligarchs, as well as by the oligarchs in waiting, of the non-partisan independent-minded individuals occupying the offices of the Contractor General and of the Independent Commissioner of Investigations. So what to make of this institutional independence protected by the Constitution? For ensuring the rule of law, it is useless. Hence the lawlessness rampant from the top to the bottom of society. For ensuring the rule of oligarchs, it is demonstrably perfect. So what to make of the Jamaica Constitution, 1962? It is oligarchic. For, as the designers of a constitution should have had the wisdom of the ways of the world to have expected, given the opportunity to participate in privileged power, as the constitutional loopholes present to leaders of any political regime, few can resist. So, in fact, the loopholes are not due to mistaken oversight but are critical designed components of the deception that is Jamaican independence. One type of constitutional loophole is demonstrated in the case of the former Solicitor General Vashiani. The Prime Minister effectively selects the members of all the institutionally independent services commissions. The PM, as in the case discussed, may also remove commissioners. Thus, as he Golding demonstrated, if one panel is not compliant with oligarchic assaults on its institutional independence, then it may be expeditiously removed and a new set of compliant commissioners empaneled. The other type of constitutional loophole results from the parliamentary majority, an institution of the Constitution that refers actually to a majority united in decision-making activities in the House of Representatives, being the decisive law-making element as well as being the secure parliamentary base of the Cabinet, its executive subcommittee. The parliamentary majority decides all questions of administrative, civil and criminal lawmaking. The parliamentary majority is also, as the legislature, the ultimate protector of the public purse. It is the institution that the finance minister must appeal to in order to make drawdowns, by means of appropriation acts, from the consolidated fund. Here, therefore, in the parliamentary majority, is the integration of the legislature and the executive. Such a combination has long been recognized as being the essential characteristic of the sovereign in any state. The sovereign is the entity in a state, individual or collective, that can do anything that it chooses to do without legal sanction. With its essential powers of lawmaking and state administration, the latter including command of the coercive military, constabulary, judiciary, and penal apparatuses, the powers of the sovereign includes binding anyone in the state by means of laws that they choose to make and the executive actions they choose to take. Thus, a sovereign may establish any levy, seize any property, banish or imprison or even eliminate anyone, all without legal sanctions, simply because it is the sovereign that makes the laws and so may legalize any of its intended executive actions. Therefore, the sovereign is the one truly independent institution. So the finance minister, in approaching the sovereign parliamentary majority with his request for legalization of his intended raid on the National Housing Fund, was so confident of its support that he preemptorily and publicly excluded the only other source of the funds available. This was the source that the IMF, itself, knew was capable, because this source was the very one they knew that had benefited the most from the past financial irresponsibility of successive regimes, the set of local holders of significant amounts of government bonds, the large, and mainly financial, private businesses. So the IMF proposed that there should be the haircut of the value represented by the paper instruments they held. However, the finance minister stood up, on behalf of the bondholders, to the mighty financial wisdom, global influence and capital resources of the IMF. What a brave display by the finance minister! If only he was as militant in the interests of all the people and not just in the interests of the big financiers. However, as the finance minister expected, he was not disappointed by the sovereign parliamentary majority. The raid on the NHF requested by the finance minister was legalized by the parliamentary majority and executed by its finance ministry. It was an act of a constitutional sovereign and, indeed, was truly a royal depredation. The pre-existent law prohibiting the raid was not a shackle. So the two centers of oligarchic powers are the institutions of the parliamentary majority and of the Prime Minister. However, the two are not equal. The Prime Minister is appointed by, and must maintain the confidence of, the parliamentary majority, who may remove him or her by a vote of no confidence. No one, and no institution, in Jamaica may remove the parliamentary majority, so it is the one, truly independent, institution in Jamaica. It is the sovereign of the Jamaican state. Hence, the references to an existent parliamentary sovereign, by leading oligarchs, are in fact truly reflective of the reality. The sovereignty of the parliamentary majority and the inclusion of the constitutional procedures for the subversion of the rule of law were ensured by the Moy Commission, the British Colonial Office, and the Jamaican Bipartisan Legal Drafting Committee of the Constitution, members of which included prominent lawyers and barristers. Universal adult suffrage and party political pluralism make the oligarchic constitution and its public institutions seemingly democratic. The oligarchic sovereignty of the parliamentary majority and the constitutional loopholes permitting ministerial oligarchical exhibitions prove otherwise. Polytricks, institutions, and social progress in Jamaica. Chapter 4. The People's Hopes and Corrective Civics. Section 1. The curious constitutional case of the missing statements of principles and declaration of enactment. Without a doubt, institutional independence, the constitutional protection of the checks on governmental excess, is definitely desirable. Since, in order to escape logical degeneracy, it cannot be founded on institutions based on the Constitution itself, as then it would end up being similarly compromised as unavoidably obtains presently, then it must be based outside the Constitution. But, how is this to be, if the Constitution is the foundation of all public institutions? Since the Constitution has to be based on something external to itself, as are all things, then, possibly, the foundation of the Constitution may also provide a suitable basis for the independence and protection of the institutional checks and balances. But what is the Jamaica Constitution, 1962, itself based on? It is based on the recommendations of the Moy Commission of the British state. So its very conception was not Jamaican. Taking a clue from the word public in the phrase public institutions, we may imagine, at this point, that if the Constitution, a public institution, was based on the people, that is, if the people had chosen a drafted document to be the Constitution of Jamaica in a referendum based on universal adult suffrage, then the people themselves would be the natural defenders, the natural base, of their own constitution. Then the relevance of the term public in the phrase public institutions would be affirmed and well grounded. Furthermore, the Constitution so founded would be Jamaican in origin, basis, nature, and objectives. In order for all this to have occurred, then the people themselves would need to be actually independent, both in actual status as well as in their minds, in order both to establish an independent constitution and to declare it. In other words, the people would have to be the collective sovereign of Jamaica. This would have been the truly democratic manner to go about becoming independent. However, there never really was a people's movement for political independence. It was a mere labor unrest that so rattled the state of the British Empire that it initiated, planned, and implemented this long-term project of political tutelage leading to so-called political independence. So, with exclusive interests themselves, the British decided that such interests were better ensured by handing over their rule to a well-prepared and eager exclusive native political elite, a neo-colonial oligarchy. Thus the British state decided to grant independence to Jamaica, that is, it decided to replace its own direct colonial rule with its own creation of a neo-colonial oligarchic state. But the sly British fox had in mind indefinitely long-term protection of its interests in Jamaica. Their objectives were to secure, in respect of Jamaica, their interests of property, commerce, and diplomacy. These interests do not include, and are often in the way of, those of the people. So, to secure their interests against potential popular challenges, the rule of the oligarchs they intended to institute had to be disguised as a democracy. In order to accomplish this deception, the British, firstly, had to institute universal adult suffrage so as to entrain the people into party political practice and, secondly, to institute internal self-government in order to provide the conditions for the selection and development of the initial set of candidate oligarchs. This was achieved in the first phase of the implementation of the recommendations of the Moy Commission. Then at the start of so-called independence, the emergent native oligarchy was embellished with the independent democratic veneer of an independence constitution, along with the accompanying bag of the Polytricks of party politics to stultify the urges of the people for real self-determination. In this way, the indefinite continuance of oligarchic rule was to be ensured. This process of institutional change and mass deception took over 2 decades to be effectuated. The complex constitutional contortions required, in order for the British to create an independent Jamaican oligarchy with a convincing democratic image, when executed, resulted in certain strange constitutional constructions. One quite queer aspect of the Jamaica Constitution, 1962, is that, in its text, there appears no statement of its own principles, including the basis of its establishment. Another unusual feature is there no reference to the occasion and agency of its enactment. Clear declarations of these key introductory components of a constitution of a state are usually made in a preamble or in the first sections of a constitution of a state. The principles of establishment are those defining the very soul of the constitution. Mention, in the Constitution, of the extremely auspicious occasion of enactment is necessary in order to constitutionally recognize its creators and to institutionalize the commencement of the era of its application. The following, for example, is an excerpt from the Constitution of India. We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign socialist secular democratic republic and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. In our Constituent Assembly this 26th day of November, 1949, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution. The following is another excerpt, this time from the California Constitution. All political power is inherent in the people. Government is instituted for their protection, security, and benefit, and they have the right to alter or reform it when the public good may require. Now these excerpts were not chosen from specially selected constitutions. However, they clearly illustrate that statements of principles and declarations of enactment are quite usual in any constitution. and the reasons for their inclusions are that through such explicit declarations, it is made clear that the people hold all political powers by which the Constitution is established by the people as its primary political instrument. So the Constitution is made by the people for the good of the people, the public good. For who can define the public good, but the people themselves? These excerpts therefore assert all that the Jamaica Constitution studiously avoids: the primacy of the people in the country and their priority with respect to the Constitution that they alone, morally and logically, can bring into force, especially as a truly democratic constitution. But the unanswered question remains: why are such statements of principles and declarations of enactment missing from the Jamaica Constitution, 1962? It is because the truths of minority political privilege that they should contain are so shameful and dangerous to their secret objectives that they cannot be allowed to see the light of day. And the lies of political inclusion that they might contain would be so easily and damningly challenged and so lead to the defeat of their exclusive intentions. 4. A statement of principles and references to enactment would reveal the fact that with regard to the Jamaica Constitution, 1962, the people played no part, not in drafting, reviewing, agreeing, nor in establishing it. That is, there was no popularly and freely elected constituent assembly with its members charged with producing a draft constitution on behalf of the people of Jamaica. Neither was there a national referendum on the draft constitution so produced. So the people never drafted nor enacted their own constitution. Neither were the people declared the basis, the bearer, of all political power. Nor were the good of the people, the public good, declared as the reason that the Jamaica Constitution was brought into existence, for it was not. Therefore, the Constitution was not of the people, nor in their interests. So, the only way for the British state to have proceeded in their deception was to ensure the absence of any vital constitutional parts such as statements of principles and declarations of enactment, for, otherwise, any way them tan, maka them. Thus the mangling of the drafting exercise, the shocking exclusion of the principles and the declaration of enactment of the Constitution, was nevertheless allowed to go forward and into the Jamaica Constitution, 1962. They had all the time and experience to have known of the customary inclusion of such constitutional parts, so ignorance cannot be the cause of their absences. This was no mistake, but was a scheme of deception of the Jamaican people conceptualized by the Moy Commission and the Colonial Office, with the willing participation of the bipartisan drafting committee, executed by the British state, and since continued by the politicians and their parties. Now, after decades of undisturbed enjoyment of the fruits of exclusive minority rule, the Jamaican oligarchs have been emboldened. 1. Possibly the greatest of the oligarchs, boastfully revealed that the law is not a shackle, while omitting to add the words to oligarchs. Another, for strictly personal reasons, was moved to reveal, by his actions, the constitutional loopholes that could be used to get around the constitutional armor apparently erected to defend the Constitution from oligarchic assaults. What are the objectives of the oligarchs? Evidently, they include self-aggrandizement, unlimited powers, and ostentatious consumption. The ensuing displays of wealth, power, and impunity by the oligarchs have become examples of success at the very peak of society and so have gone viral and have created the culture of the big man. Almost everyone admires and desires to be a big man. Any criticism of them or their lifestyle is regarded as bad mind. For those without money, their best bet for socio-economic ascendancy is through the party political process. But, even those with money seem attracted by the appeal of oligarchic power, its fearful influence, and its police outriders. So, having been granted independence, where the people might have expected political and economic inclusion, there has been political and economic exclusion, where they might have expected the rule of law. There was the rule of the oligarchs, where they might have expected economic and social progress. There has been economic stagnation and social decline, and where they might have expected social justice, there has been social injustice. Section 2. Civics and the fulfillment of the hopes of our ancestors. Here, if we listen intently, we may hear the call of Sankofa beckoning to us to return to our past in order to strengthen ourselves so that we might press ahead. 4. Did not our ancestors concentrate their fighting forces purely on the institutions of their enslavers and oppressors? So, instead of remaining bewitched by party political illusions, Polytricks, designed by the Moy Commission, implemented by the UK state, and performed by the Jamaican politicians and their political parties, let us concentrate our efforts on the creative reconstruction of the oligarchic political institutions. However, after the long hiatus away from the institutional perspective, beginning in 1944, the people may, in their search for sustained and inclusive development, do well for themselves now to turn their attentions to studying the public institutions of Jamaica. Public institutions, their objectives, establishment, operations, interoperations, and their results, constitute the subject matter of civics. All citizens should again take up, in earnest, the study of civics, but this time not to foster an uncritical, dumb, patriotism, but to critically determine what changes are required and how they are to be effected in order to achieve true independence and sustained and inclusive economic growth, improved living standards, and social harmony. For these crucial reasons, urgent revision of the Jamaica Constitution, 1962, is fully justified. In fact, given the compromised nature of the genesis of this constitution and its resulting oligarchic nature, common sense demands a brand new constitution. So, if the popular study of civics is properly engaged, then eventually the people may collectively produce a draft constitution for a truly independent, inclusive, and progressive Jamaican society to be established one sweet day, hopefully earlier than later. Let us, when building such a magnificent constitution, base it on the rock of the whole people. Let us reform the exclusive political institutions to become inclusive so that all members of society have a voice at the table of political decision-making. By such means, it will be ensured that in the public economic institutions instituted by the political institutions all the people will, hereto, have a voice at the table of decision-making. It is only by such measures will Jamaicans enjoy sustained and inclusive economic development. Inclusive political institutions and the resulting inclusive economic development they produce will lead to the production of social peace, low crime rates, and harmony. A constitution for Jamaica so produced would not then need to counterfeit itself as brand Jamaica, as then it would actually be made in Jamaica by all Jamaicans and for all Jamaicans. Our ancestors should be thrilled to see the long-awaited fulfillment of their centuries-old unceasing endeavors for liberty, self-determination, unity, peace, and prosperity achieved through the independent actions of their very own descendants, informed by their ancient wisdom, and so with the gift of their loving guidance. What joys await us! Praises be to the ancestors.